The latest consumer price index shows grocery prices in July rose 2.2% compared to last year, as CBS's Lisa Rosner reports. The rising cost of food is driving an affordability crisis, forcing families to make tough choices.
Sandra Cora is food shopping for her mom, who lives on a fixed income.
She can barely afford half of this stuff. Like, do you pay your rent or you buy food?
Everyday staples saw significant.
Walmart to, quote, eat the cost of rising tariffs so they can keep prices low for consumers. A retail giant is closing stores. Walmart plans to shut down 269 stores.
World's biggest retailer by volume and profit, that would be Walmart, warned today that it may have to start raising prices later this month due to President Trump's tariff policy.
The first blow came with little warning. A sweeping wave of tariffs struck the U.S. retail system, setting off
stronger than expected earnings with a 29% rise in the most recent quarter, attracting price-conscious consumers from all income levels.
How much does the economy factor into your shopping decisions?
A lot.
The revenue boost tells a tale of two economies. Walmart says while lower-income Americans are spending less, higher-income households are driving the gains. Walmart's strong earnings coincide with the announcement of the September jobs report.
Something unbelievable happened overnight, something even the world's largest retailer never saw coming. While most Americans slept, a wave of emergency announcements rolled out from Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, Ghana, Ethiopia, Rwanda, and more than 20 other African nations. One after another, they declared a sudden and immediate halt on a list of exports that had quietly become the invisible backbone of U.S. retail shelves. And when dawn finally broke in America, Walmart woke up to a crisis that shook the company to its core. Warehouse managers reported the first signs. Entire delivery schedules canceled without explanation. Containers that were supposed to arrive at ports simply didn't. Import dashboards went dark, and by noon, Walmart executives realized the unthinkable. Africa had blocked the export of dozens of goods that Walmart relies on to keep its prices low, its shelves full, and its supply chain stable. This wasn't a slow decline. This wasn't a warning shot. This was an economic earthquake. From cocoa and textiles to essential agricultural extracts, processed foods, household materials, and even packaging components, Africa didn't just slow exports. It froze them overnight, and the company that once prided itself on being too big to fail suddenly found itself scrambling to answer one question. How do you run a global giant when an entire continent decides it's done playing by your rules? Inside Walmart headquarters, panic spread, emergency meetings, overnight calls with Washington, analysts projecting billions in losses. Meanwhile, African nations stood firm, confident, united, and unwilling to reverse the ban, because this wasn't a trade disagreement, this was a message, a power shift, a silent declaration that Africa was no longer going to fuel America's affordability economy at the expense of its own development. And as Walmart watched its carefully engineered supply empire begin to crack, the rest of the world realized something even bigger. If Africa can bring a giant like Walmart to its knees overnight, what or who is next?
Target, one of America's biggest and most beloved retailers, known for its large and airy stores, a wide selection of products at affordable prices, and some of the most exciting partnerships in retail. Its loyalty program boasts 100 million members. The retailer sold a total of $106.6 billion of goods in 2024.
That's really something that Target has built, this idea of a joyful, fun shopping experience that's colorful and will introduce you to...
Prices are going up at Walmart.
Yeah, the company says it can no longer absorb the cost of President Trump's tariff.
Walmart, the retail giant, plans to close 3 of its U.S.-based technology stores, asking hundreds of workers to relocate while retaining their jobs.
Food prices as low as possible. He's looking at possibly taking a hit on some of those items, but then having to raise prices on other items. Again, we're not sure exactly how much prices could go up, but we're going to start
down. Eggs are way down. Groceries are down very substantially, but down. Almost everything's down. Now I'd like to see interest rates come down a little bit, and you're going to see billions of dollars, even trillions of dollars coming into our country very soon in the form of tariffs, because we were abused by presidents that, frankly, in all fairness, it wasn't their expertise, but they had no idea what they were doing.
The panic inside America's largest retail giant began long before the headlines appeared, but the shock became impossible to conceal the moment African nations announced a sudden, coordinated blockade on key U.S. imports. Overnight, shelves that once overflowed with familiar products faced a disruption no one in Washington or in America, as corporate world had ever anticipated. For decades, major U.S. companies operated under the belief that Africa's markets were predictable, pliable, and permanently dependent on foreign imports. But a new wave of policy reforms sweeping across Africa shattered that illusion completely. The announcement hit like an earthquake. Multiple African governments had simultaneously halted the entry of dozens of American goods, particularly the products that formed the backbone of America's retail empire. Inside the headquarters of America's biggest retailer, the atmosphere turned electric with fear. What began as a quiet tremor in logistics reports quickly escalated into a crisis meeting involving supply chain specialists, economic analysts, and geopolitical advisors. The data on the screens was unforgiving. Africa had not just blocked random items, it had targeted categories that the United States relied on for steady market inflow. Consumer goods, packaged foods, textiles, agricultural products, and household materials, entire sectors were suddenly severed. For Walmart, Africa was not just another sales region. It had been a fast-expanding frontier, a continent with over 1 billion consumers, rising middle classes, modernizing cities, and some of the fastest-growing retail markets on Earth. The blockade hit at the worst possible time for America. With inflation rising at home, supply chains still fragile, and global competitors expanding aggressively, Washington had assumed African nations would cling to U.S. trade ties for stability. But Africa was moving in a different direction, one driven by sovereignty, industrialization, and the determination to escape long-standing dependency on foreign imports. The new wave of African economic policies was bold, unapologetic, and deeply strategic. Many countries had simultaneously launched industrial zones aimed at replacing imported goods with locally manufactured ones. Others had partnered with Asian economic blocs to support domestic production. The result was a continent quickly transitioning from importer to producer and refusing to allow its markets to serve as dumping grounds for foreign goods. Walmart's executives struggled to comprehend how things had changed so quickly. Only a few years earlier, American retail companies treated Africa as a guaranteed growth engine. New stores were opening in South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, and Ghana. Distribution centers were being built, and logistics routes were expanding. The company had invested heavily in understanding African consumer behavior, expecting decades of rising profits. But the new African economic direction dismantled those assumptions. The blockade message was clear. Africa no longer wanted to import what it could produce. African nations were now prioritizing local farmers, manufacturers, and regional trading blocs over foreign retailers. Across Africa, the shift had been quietly brewing for years. The African Continental Free Trade Area (AfTA) had begun accelerating regional production networks, linking factories, farmland, and ports across the continent. African leaders emphasized a straightforward message: the continent would no longer export raw materials while importing finished goods at inflated prices. Manufacturing had to happen on African soil, not on foreign assembly lines. With that philosophy, many African nations introduced policies restricting or outright banning imports of American agricultural products, processed foods, clothing, and household goods, items that Walmart depended on for shelf stability. Walmart executives were alarmed not just by the economic impact but by the symbolic blow. The blockade represented a deeper geopolitical reality. Africa was no longer negotiating from weakness. For the first time in modern trade history, African countries acted in complete unity, enforcing a decision that directly impacted a major U.S. giant without fear of retaliation. Washington's diplomatic channels scrambled to respond, but the statements coming from African capitals were firm, coordinated, and unwavering. They emphasized economic sovereignty, job creation, and the end of foreign dominance in African retail markets. While American media outlets framed the situation as a trade shock, the movement within Africa was widely celebrated. African citizens, from farmers to factory workers, saw the blockade as a turning point, a moment of continental pride. Local producers who had long struggled to compete against cheap foreign imports suddenly gained a competitive environment. African agricultural cooperatives expanded rapidly, textile industries revived, and local brands began replacing American imports on store shelves. Countries like Ethiopia, Rwanda, Tanzania, and Senegal became hubs of new manufacturing capacity. African-made goods were no longer the exception, they were fast becoming the new standard. In the United States, the fallout grew heavier by the day. Walmart's supply chain reports revealed that the losses extended far beyond Africa. Many of the products originally destined for African markets had to be rerouted, discounted, or stored in costly warehouses. Investors panicked as projections revealed billions in potential long-term losses. U.S. farmers and manufacturers dependent on African exports began pressuring Washington to intervene. Wheat producers in Kansas, soybean farmers in Iowa, and poultry suppliers in Arkansas, all of them suddenly found themselves locked out of a market they once dominated. Washington attempted diplomatic outreach, but African nations remained aligned. The blockade was not a temporary protest, it was a structural economic shift. African leaders emphasized that the continent was building self-reliance, not negotiating for concessions. Trade with the United States would resume only if aligned with Africa's new industrial goals. The message was unmistakable. Africa was no longer a passive consumer, it was an emerging global producer. Meanwhile, global competitors wasted no time. China, India, Turkey, South Korea, and Brazil quickly stepped into the vacuum. They offered Africa technology transfers, joint ventures, industrial funding, and support for local manufacturing, all conditions Africa had begged the West to consider for decades, with the United States sidelined. These nations cemented their presence across African markets, deepening economic ties that Washington struggled to counter. The panic inside America's largest retailer grew into something far larger, a crisis that reflected a global realignment of trade power. Walmart's executives realized something Washington refused to admit: the era of American dominance in African markets was over. Africa was rising with a unified economic identity, shifting alliances, and a trade strategy rooted in strength, not dependency. And for the first time, the United States found itself outside the center of influence, watching from a distance as Africa reshaped the rules of global commerce. The shockwaves of Africa's overnight blockade on U.S. imports deepened as regional organizations across the continent began expanding the policy into a full-scale economic realignment. What initially appeared to be a sudden trade disruption evolved into a coordinated restructuring of African markets, supply chains, and production systems. African nations understood their leverage. With over 1 billion consumers and some of the fastest-growing urban populations in the world, their collective purchasing power was no longer a bargaining chip, it was a geopolitical weapon, and they were wielding it with precision. Inside Washington, the atmosphere thickened with alarm. Analysts scrambled to predict the long-term implications of losing unrestricted access to African markets. Years of assuming that Africa would remain dependent on foreign goods had blinded many American policymakers to the continent's growing manufacturing, agricultural, and technological capabilities. Worse still, rivals were already benefiting from America's miscalculation. China, India, and Brazil had positioned themselves as Africa's preferred economic partners by offering what the U.S. had long refused: respect for local industry, equitable trade terms, and investment that prioritized African workers over foreign corporations. Walmart, which had expanded aggressively across Africa with the expectation of dominating the retail space, found its entire strategy collapsing. The company had built distribution routes assuming long-term reliance on U.S. suppliers. Warehouses across Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, and South Africa had been optimized for American inventory. But with the blockade in place, trucks that once arrived daily with American-made household products were idle, storage facilities were underutilized, and local stores were forced to pivot quickly to avoid empty shelves. Yet something unexpected began happening within Africa that caught global attention. Instead of chaos or shortages, many local markets began to flourish. African governments had prepared for this moment more thoroughly than Washington believed. Several nations activated emergency manufacturing programs to fast-track the production of goods previously imported from abroad. In Tanzania, textile factories surged into round-the-clock production. In Kenya, processing plants that had once struggled to compete with cheap American imports now saw explosive demand. In Senegal and Ghana, agricultural cooperatives rapidly expanded their supply chains to fill gaps created by the ban on U.S. food products. African consumers embraced the shift faster than anyone expected. For decades, foreign goods were marketed as superior, while local products were sidelined. But the new policies, combined with an assertive continental pride, transformed consumer preferences. African-made goods once overshadowed became symbols of sovereignty and economic independence. Supermarkets that formerly depended on U.S. brands now prominently displayed regional alternatives: local cooking oils, local cereals, local cleaning supplies, and local garments. Far from resisting the transition, African shoppers celebrated it. Social media across the continent exploded with hashtags promoting African products over foreign imports. This rapid local adaptation shocked American economists who had predicted widespread economic instability. They failed to understand that Africa had spent years quietly building resilience. The African Continental Free Trade Area created a foundation of intra-African commerce that drastically reduced reliance on external suppliers. African nations had also invested heavily in road networks, industrial parks, renewable energy facilities, and digital infrastructure investments that had been overshadowed by Western narratives focusing on poverty and underdevelopment. Now those investments were paying off. Walmart's leadership attempted to pivot by switching to regional suppliers, but the shift was too large and too rapid to be managed overnight. The company had structured its African operations around imported American goods that yielded high margins. Local African products, while rapidly improving, operated under different pricing structures, regulations, and logistical networks. The retailer struggled to renegotiate contracts, adjust distribution routes, and integrate suppliers who were not accustomed to operating within a massive multinational system. At the same time, African competitors began emerging with remarkable speed. Local retail chains strengthened their positions by forming alliances with regional manufacturers. These African retailers could adapt faster, source cheaper, and build loyalty more effectively than Walmart. In South Africa, Botswana, and Namibia, homegrown retail giants expanded into newly opened markets, taking advantage of Walmart's vulnerability. In Kenya, Rwanda, and Uganda, new supermarket chains emerged with a purely African supply chain model. These regional players were not just filling gaps, they were replacing the American retail presence entirely. Washington's response became increasingly frantic. U.S. trade delegates were dispatched to African capitals in attempts to negotiate exemptions or temporary pauses in the blockade, but African nations responded with a unified stance. The era of one-sided trade was over. Some African leaders reminded Washington of decades of trade imbalances, agricultural dumping, and policies that destroyed local industries. The blockade was not retaliation, it was correction. Africa was prioritizing development, industrialization, and regional self-sufficiency, not the preservation of foreign profits. The geopolitical implications grew even more alarming for the United States as China and India expanded their footprint. Both nations offered African countries preferential trade deals that provided access to capital, technology transfers, and joint ventures, conditions that the U.S. had historically rejected. African leaders recognized these offers as tools to accelerate industrial growth and reduce dependency on Western imports. With U.S. goods restricted, China and India filled the vacuum effortlessly. China, already Africa's largest trade partner, deepened its integration by launching new manufacturing hubs in Ethiopia, Angola, and Egypt. These hubs were designed not to import Chinese goods but to produce African goods for African consumers. India strengthened its pharmaceutical and agricultural presence across West and East Africa. Turkey expanded its construction and textiles industries throughout the continent. Meanwhile, American companies watched helplessly as their once secure market share evaporated. Within the U.S., the political consequences intensified. Farmers who relied heavily on African exports launched protests demanding government action. Poultry producers, dairy farmers, wheat growers, and soybean suppliers, many already struggling from previous trade disputes, now faced devastating losses. The agricultural belt saw rising discontent as African markets disappeared overnight. Inflation in the U.S. worsened as American companies were forced to reroute goods or destroy its old inventory. Retail prices rose at home, supply chains became clogged, and economic analysts began predicting long-term structural damage. The blockade, which Washington initially dismissed as temporary, was rapidly reshaping global trade flows. Investors shifted their attention to African manufacturing, African retail expansion, and African consumer markets, further weakening the influence of American corporations. Through all of this, Africa remained steady in its message. The continent was charting a new economic path. It was no longer willing to be a passive player in global trade. It wanted value addition, industrial growth, and equitable partnerships. Restricting U.S. imports was not a radical act, it was the beginning of a long-awaited transformation. And as Africa rose with unity and purpose, America, once confident in its dominance, found itself chasing a world that no longer revolved around its economic power. As the weeks passed, Africa's decision to block U.S. imports evolved from a disruptive policy into a transformative economic revolution, one that reshaped global trade structures and permanently altered Washington's strategic position. What began as a crisis for American corporations had grown into a multi-layered continental shift that empowered African nations in ways the West had long underestimated. The impact was no longer confined to retail chains or agricultural exporters. It had expanded into finance, logistics, manufacturing, and global power balances. Walmart, once confident it could ride out the storm, now realized the scale of the challenge was far beyond a temporary shock. Its supply chain architecture had been designed for American dominance, not African autonomy. The company had optimized logistics around U.S.-made goods because it assumed Africa would continue depending on them. But after the blockade, the retailer discovered that most African governments had already prepared alternative routes and backup suppliers. These new networks were not makeshift, they were the early stages of a self-sustaining continental economic system. Africa's shift toward internal production accelerated faster than analysts had predicted. Nations such as Egypt, Kenya, Ethiopia, Ghana, Morocco, Nigeria, and South Africa rapidly scaled industrial zones that had been dormant or underfunded for years. Some reopened factories that had been shut down due to past competition from cheaper American imports. Others launched entirely new facilities designed to replace imported goods with local alternatives. Governments offered tax incentives, energy subsidies, and land grants to local businesses willing to produce at scale. The transformation wasn't merely economic, it was psychological. African consumers no longer associated foreign products with prestige or superiority. There was newfound pride in buying local, a symbolic reclamation of economic identity. Across major cities, outdoor markets and supermarkets alike celebrated homegrown goods campaigns. The shift in consumer behavior created a booming demand for African-made products, reinforcing the domestic production surge. Local brands that had once struggled for shelf space now found themselves at the center of national conversations and cultural movements. At the continental level, the African Continental Free Trade Area played a crucial role. Member states fast-tracked agreements that eliminated intra-African tariffs on essential goods, allowing raw materials, manufactured products, and inputs to move across borders with unprecedented freedom. This integration reduced production costs, improved logistics, and created a web of economic interdependence strong enough to challenge foreign influence. Meanwhile, American officials grew increasingly frustrated. Washington had grown accustomed to setting global trade terms, not negotiating from a position of weakness. Yet African nations were resolute. They had spent decades watching their industries collapse under the pressure of subsidized imports. They had seen how unequal trade terms kept them dependent on external suppliers, and after years of diplomatic promises that never materialized, they no longer trusted Western assurances. The geopolitical consequences intensified as other global powers capitalized on America's vulnerability. China expanded its involvement in African industrial development, not through loans alone but through joint ventures, equity investments, and manufacturing partnerships. India strengthened trade ties through pharmaceutical plants, textile industries, and agricultural processing centers. Brazil entered with large-scale biofuel partnerships, and Turkey expanded construction and logistics infrastructure across East and West Africa. American companies, once confident they could re-enter African markets through negotiation or pressure, now faced competition from multiple nations deeply embedded in Africa's economic strategy. The U.S. had not simply lost trade access, it had lost influence. Inside the United States, economic pressure grew heavier. Farmers who had relied on African exports faced worsening losses as massive inventories of unsold goods piled up. Warehouses overflowed with poultry, dairy products, cotton, soybeans, and processed foods that no longer had a market. Many agricultural producers operated on thin margins, and without African demand, their financial stability evaporated. Some were forced to close, others defaulted on loans, and others shifted to desperate lobbying efforts aimed at reversing Africa's blockade. Retailers across the U.S. also felt the repercussions. The loss of African markets meant fewer sales, lower profits, and rising costs. Supply chain disruptions caused ripple effects in domestic pricing, contributing to inflationary pressures. Investors, recognizing the long-term implications, began reallocating capital toward African manufacturing and Asian logistics, a sign that U.S. corporations were losing their global appeal. American media framed the situation as a sudden geopolitical crisis, but African leaders countered that the West had simply ignored decades of warnings. The continent had been transitioning toward economic independence long before the blockade. The rise of digital payment systems, regional trade alliances, renewable energy expansion, and industrial diversification were all indicators that Africa had reached a critical stage of maturity. The blockade was not an impulsive move, it was the final break from a system that had never allowed Africa to thrive on its own terms. As African manufacturing expanded, the continent began exporting to new global markets. Europe, struggling with its own internal economic challenges, was forced to rely more heavily on African goods than before. Asia deepened its trade ties with Africa to secure long-term resource cooperation. Middle Eastern nations partnered with African agricultural developers to enhance food security. Africa was no longer seen as a passive participant but as a central node in global commerce. Walmart's collapse in Africa became a symbol of a much larger shift. American companies could no longer assume guaranteed dominance in international markets. They faced a reality where African nations demanded fairness, transparency, and equal partnership conditions that had long been denied. Within African cities, the economic boom was visible. Industrial parks buzzed with activity, ports operated at full capacity, and energy grids expanded to meet rising demand. Young entrepreneurs established businesses supplying local products that previously came from abroad. Governments invested in vocational training programs to expand the skilled labor workforce. Transportation corridors between East, West, North, Central, and Southern Africa strengthened logistical ties across borders. Airports and seaports upgraded their infrastructure to support higher volumes of regional trade. But perhaps the most significant outcome was Africa's strengthened sense of unity after decades of fragmentation. The continent was acting with a level of coordination the world had not seen before. Economic independence was no longer a dream, it was a shared continental strategy. The blockade of U.S. goods had become a catalyst that accelerated Africa's transformation into a self-sustaining, economically assertive bloc. By the end of the year, global analysts admitted what Washington had refused to acknowledge. Africa had rewritten the rules of trade, the power dynamics had shifted, the continent had proven that it possessed not only the resources but the will and coordination to challenge global giants. The United States, once confident it could dictate terms to the world, now faced a stark new reality. Africa's economic rise was irreversible, its unified stance was unbreakable, and its refusal to remain a market for foreign exploitation had changed the balance of global power forever. The blockade had started as an economic shock, but it ended as a declaration of sovereignty, one that reshaped the future of world trade and forced America to confront a world where Africa was no longer beneath the negotiating table but standing firmly at its center.